We are live. Welcome everyone to the Great Mediation Debate. And boy, have we got an awesome session in store for you tonight. I think we've got a record number of registrations, enough to fill an Airbus 380 with over 800 people queuing up in the departure lounge. But we'll manage to squeeze everyone into a 747. We're also streaming live on our YouTube channel. So if your connection drops out, head over to YouTube/Mediator Academy and join in the debate from there. On the panel tonight, we have an illustrious group of professionals that you wouldn't want to be stuck at a poker table with late at night. From the UK, we've got William Wood, QC, who knows when to hold them and when to fold them. Jane Player, who's always got an ace or two up her sleeve. And then from the island of Ireland, we have Sabine Walsh, who has been known from time to time to bet the farm, and a wild card, the visionary, Justice Michael Peart. Now, every debate needs a dealer, someone that is intellectually sharp, has the gravitas to manage some big egos and keep the debate moving. But we couldn't find anyone fitting that description. So stacking the deck in this showdown tonight is the mighty Professor Brian Hutchinson from the University College Dublin. So before I hand over to Brian, I want to say a little bit about Mediator Academy and the context for this event tonight. I'm Ali Davis, co-founder of Mediator Academy, where we design and develop fully online postgraduate programs that prepare you for the 21st century world of work. And we do this in partnership with top educational institutions. And tonight, we are hosting this event with one of our partners, University College Dublin, Sutherland School of Law, where we have a program running in its second year. The program is a fully online postgraduate professional diploma in dispute resolution with a specialism in mediation. Now, applications for the January 22 dates are open. And if you apply before the end of this month, UCD will offer you a generous enrollment discount. So if you want to find out more, just head on over to our website, mediatoracademy.com, download a prospectus, or head over to UCD, Sutherland School of Law website, and all applications are processed by the amazing enrollments team at UCD. Now then, one of my favorite lines from the great Irish poet, William B. Yeats, up in Sligo, I believe, Sabine, is this: education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And someone that lit my mediation fire was the late and great David Richbell. David was an experienced commercial mediator with over 1,000 cases under his belt. And when he wasn't mediating commercial disputes, he would be mediating interfaith and religious disputes, and he'd be educating and mentoring the next generation of mediators. David trained many of the top commercial mediators practicing today, and he was one of the OGs of the mediation scene here in the UK. David was an inspiration to me, but also many others starting out on the road less traveled, trying hard to break into the mediation field. He took many young mediators under his wing and mentored them, and he did it with a big heart and a generosity of spirit that was truly humbling. Now, David also started the famous Martyr Mediation Debates deep down in the bowels of BAT on the embankment. These were also known as the Tony Curtis debates to honor his mentor, Tony Curtis. These debates were fast and furious and always struck the right balance between education and entertainment. This is what we're hoping to achieve tonight with this debate in David's honor. It's also where I met his son, Ollie Richbell, who's in the audience tonight and has picked up the baton and is definitely charging ahead with building on David's legacy with his own dispute avoidance and resolution firm, the DARP, and has obviously inherited his old man's charm and talent for conflict resolution and entrepreneurship. So it's a real honor to be hosting this event tonight. Thanks, Ollie, and hope you enjoy it. Now then, fold your tray tables away, put your seats in an upright position, and fasten your seatbelts, because this could get a little bumpy as I hand you all over to the competent and mighty Professor Brian Hutchinson. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Aled. Good evening, everyone from the cockpit, and welcome on board. Thank you for joining us. The motion for this evening's great debate in memory of David Richbell is that this House believes that the benefits of mandatory mediation outweigh the costs. Speaking as the proposition team in favour of this evening's motion are Jane Player and Bill Wood. Jane is a leading international mediator with a wide-ranging commercial practice and over 30 years' experience as a commercial litigator in city practices. She runs her own practice and is also a member of the Mediation Chamber's Independent Mediators. Bill Wood, QC, is also one of the UK's leading commercial mediators. He co-authored the Civil Justice Council's report on compulsory ADR, published in July 2021. And Bill is a mediator with Brick Court Chambers in London and also with Maxwell Mediators in Singapore. Speaking as the opposition team against this evening's motion are Sabine Walsh and Michael Peart. Sabine is co-founder of Mediator Academy. She is an innovator in the design and development of educational programs. She's a mediator, academic writer, and commentator on mediation, and has served as president of the Mediation Institute of Ireland. And Michael Peart served on the High Court of Ireland and Court of Appeal in Ireland until his retirement from the bench in 2019. He now practices full-time as a mediator and arbitrator. Now, the format of this evening's debate is as follows. The debate will begin with a 10-minute opening round in which each side, proposition and opposition, will have 5 minutes to introduce their arguments. This will follow then with a 20-minute main arguments round in which each side will have 10 minutes to develop the detail of their argument. There will follow a closing round of 10 minutes duration in which each team will have 5 minutes in which to conclude and rebut. It will be my privilege after that to briefly summarize the arguments on both sides to you, the jury, before the motion will be put to a vote. The vote will be managed by our host, Alan Davies, whom you've just met, and I look forward to the outcome of that. For our speakers, only friendly and helpful interventions will be tolerated, and I ask the speakers to respect my directions concerning time, with the reminder that my say on all matters will be final, even if I do change my mind at any point along the way. With that, we begin the debate, and I hand you over now to the speakers for the proposition to begin with their introductory argument.
Well, thanks, Brian. I'm going to start by quoting Lincoln, who said in 1850, "Discourage litigation, persuade your neighbours to compromise. The lawyer has a superior opportunity to be a good man. There will be business still enough. And yet still, people love to fight." Field Fisher, the law firm, did a survey in 2007, which found that parties, once they got involved in litigation, developed a deep personal dislike for the other side, which led them into costly litigation, which they later almost always regretted. Now, it's natural to want to win. The litigation process, perhaps combined with self-serving litigation advisors, increases that desire and that aggression and the need to win. For after all, an attack on our values or our integrity, which often an allegation of a breach or corporate negligence involves, is bound to trigger a wish to fight back. The side of our brain that encourages emotional responses and aggression is fed by that desire, and it crushes that rational side of our brain that might allow commercial sense and compromise to prevail. Add to that lawyers who are hired guns after all, whom their clients expect to fight their corners and not point out their weaknesses, and you've got a perfect storm. And this might explain why there are so many litigations started, despite 90% of those settling before trial. Now, to us, all of that suggests that the human being needs direction and coercion at times to see reason and to try settlement. We have an obligation as lawyers and as mediators to help those in dispute deal with those disputes better. And Bill and I consider that compulsory mediation will achieve that. Now, compulsory mediation doesn't mean compulsory settlement. The power remains with the parties in the parties' hands to either take the deal or not. The point is that they get the chance through mediation to take a cold, hard look at the alternatives. Now, the purest view that making it compulsory is against the consent, to which is the cornerstone of mediation, to us is meaningless in a system where we already have cost sanctions. And the other arguments against compulsion, that of the cost and delay of a mediation, again, are poor excuses not to mediate. We know that most mediations can be done within 3 months, if not less. And if needs be, they can happen alongside the litigation process. So delay is hardly a factor. And the costs of a mediation are a fraction of the costs of most larger litigation. Almost all the preparation for a mediation is preparation for the trial in any event. Now, we can look to other countries. British Columbia, for example, and other jurisdictions have shown that compulsory methodologies, like the notice to mediate prior to litigation, has helped to turn it into a norm. There's always going to be need for exceptions where there's been previous unsuccessful mediations, but otherwise we consider that there's a logic to coercion. We have to do something. For over 20 years now, despite our best efforts, through Wolf reforms, through the CPR changes, and through cost sanctions, human nature appears to be against voluntary mediation prevailing by itself. Litigants are perhaps like children. Once they're in a fight, they need direction to avoid self-destruction. Society appears to be becoming more competitive. People seem unable to be able to agree to disagree or argue with each other well. We need to restore civility and respect for each other. Now, Bill and I are struggling really to believe there can be any real debate about this. Surely we all agree mediation is a good idea. A product with 85% success rate is in itself a justification for compulsory model. And yet people are not using mediation voluntarily or not enough. And we're going to show tonight from Bill's main arguments that the time for advocating engagement, education, and encouragement, as was suggested by the Civil Justice Council's review in 2018, is over. We'll show beyond doubt that compulsory mediation is not contrary to its cornerstone requirement for consent. It is not egregiously costly, nor does it cause significant delay, but rather compulsory mediation will make mediation the cultural norm, and that must be for the benefit of litigants worldwide. Thank you.
Nothing to add at this stage.
Thank you very much for the proposition. So, opposition, how do you respond?
Well, good evening from the wild west of Ireland, where there is a storm warning bearing down on us as usual. But I shall use the energy of that to counter my dear friend's arguments. So my friend Michael and I are here to convince you, and particularly those of you who might be in a position of influencing the further trajectory of mediation in the UK and in Ireland, that mediation does not need to be, nor should it be mandatory in order to become mainstream. We could, in this debate, get lost in a jungle of case law, in definitions of spectrums of mandatoriness and in other legal arguments. But we want to focus on the practicalities and on the implications of this notion of compulsory mediation on the parties, on their representatives, on the judiciary, and on the justice system at large. And I think that we can do everything that Jane has suggested to make the mediation part of the dispute resolution culture in these islands and further afield, but without resorting to the oxymoronic, not moronic, notion of compulsory mediation. And myself and Michael intend to pick the best of our large list and swathe of arguments to persuade you that not only is compulsory mediation the wrong way to go, but that there is in fact a better way. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sabine. May I start first of all by being somewhat concerned that Aled described me as a wild card. I thought I got here on merit. Anyway, that apart, I want to start off by, on the basis that a picture paints 1,000 words. I just ask you to look at this beautiful, beautiful creature, and you will immediately know that it is a goose. And you may well wonder why my first intervention as being against this particular motion, which asks which suggests that the benefits of mandatory mediation don't outweigh the costs, is to refer you to Aesop's fable about the goose that laid the golden egg. And as all children know, this is a story about a man and his wife who owned a goose which laid a golden egg every single day. And they considered themselves very lucky to possess such a very rare bird. And they began to wonder just how much gold the goose might have inside it. So they cut open the goose by killing it. However, to their disappointment, they discovered that inside the bird was like any other goose and was not made of gold. And in killing the goose that laid the golden egg, they had deprived themselves of a regular source of gold. So, of course, as with every Aesop fable, there is a moral. And the moral of this particular fable, the goose that laid the golden egg, is fairly obviously that greed is bad. If the man and his wife had not been motivated by such avarice or greed for more gold, they would not have cut open the goose, and thus they would not have deprived themselves of a smaller, though regular and steady and reliable source of income from their special bird. The I want it all and I want it now mentality, which led them to kill the goose in the hope of discovering even greater riches inside it, was their undoing. You may now understand why I put up that picture of the golden goose, because the mediation process that has evolved over centuries and millennia, in fact, has always been based on the voluntary nature of the process, and has reached a point where it has almost achieved mainstream status as an effective, cost-effective, fair, flexible, consensual method of enabling warring parties to try and settle their differences. So why are we now trying to snatch defeat from the jaws of that victory by making the whole thing mandatory? Anyone who grew up in Ireland over the last decade, over the last century, certainly half century, will be familiar with the concept of compulsory Irish. This was an idea which is still in mainstream education, that by forcing people to spend hours and hours every week learning Irish, they will somehow achieve fluency and a willingness to learn. All the evidence, anecdotal on my part, admittedly, points to the contrary, that a resistance is built up to the learning of Irish by people who otherwise might have enjoyed the process, just as those of us who voluntarily learned French enjoyed that experience, or German or Italian or whatever your particular language is. As soon as you make something mandatory, you change its character. And that, I think, is one of the most compelling arguments for not going down this road of mandatory mediation. If mandatory mediation is brought in, what will it look like?
Well, perhaps we can reserve that question for the main body of argument, if I may intervene at this point in time, as your 5 minutes are up.
Thank you, Brian.
And thank you for the introductions on both sides. So on the proposition side, it works, it's needed, it hasn't been working so far, and we need compulsion. On the opposition side, making things mandatory generates a resistance, and one may end up goosed. So I now hand you back to the proposition to develop its argument. Proposition, you have 10 minutes for this segment. Over to you.
Brian, thank you. I'm sorry that Michael was scarred by compulsory Irish. I was scarred by compulsory broccoli in a similar fashion. We have to get on with life. We have to get on with life, and occasionally compulsion is appropriate. I discovered only this morning that in the tiny Oxfordshire town where I live, they've had an anti-vaccination riot. An anti-vaccination riot. There's about 4,000 people live here. It was in 1897. It was the smallpox vaccination, and they drove the police out of the town for trying to enforce vaccination rules. But people don't, I get it, people don't like compulsion. Let me just tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. I have embroidered on my pajamas, and just pausing with the pajamas for a moment, David Richbell, a great man, a very snappy dresser. Jane and I on our side have really tried to raise our game in his honour. I just wanted to mention that. But embroidered on my pajamas, just over the breast pocket, are these words: mediation is quicker, cheaper, more flexible, better for your mental health, and better for your long-term relationships than any other form of dispute resolution technique. It took a lot of thread to do it, but there it sits. Now, everybody listening to this, I suspect, is familiar with those sentiments, finds them exciting, finds them arousing, finds them almost sexy. But the bad news is, ladies and gentlemen, that your fellow citizens, the people outside this debate who don't know about Mediator Academy, your fellow citizens are not turned on by those words in the way that you are. And it's not for want of hearing them and not for want of trying. Let me give you an example. When I leave chambers in the morning, and I work in a set of barristers' chambers still, my colleagues are all going off to call people a liar over in the High Court, and they see me and they say, Bill, where are you arbitrating today? They are dispute resolution professionals, and they don't know what I do for a living. They don't understand my job. What chance has the rest of the public got? A great friend in New York talks about beauty parading before trying to get a big piece of litigation for his firm. And he says, you always go there with a brief which includes a reference to early settlement, your firm's ability to mediate, your use of settlement counsel, and so on. You get to the beauty parade, and general counsel says, the board is seething. They hate this guy. They want his head on a platter. They want blood on the floor. Can you win this case for us? And mysteriously, you don't then read out the page in your notes about mediation. It just gets ignored. Happens again. Now, I know for Jane and I, this is not a good look. We're both mediators, although you wouldn't suspect it. We're both mediators. We love what we do and we get paid for what we're doing. And on top of that, we now have the greed, and Michael has correctly diagnosed greed. We now have the greed to say that our fellow citizens should be required by law to send us more work. I see that. It's not a good look. I get that. Brian referred to the CJC report, which is probably the reason that I've got this gig. It reached three conclusions. First conclusion was that it wasn't a breach of anybody's human rights to make them engage in ADR. The second point was that there's already masses of compulsory ADR in the civil justice system in England and Wales. And the third point was that there are various considerations that may or may not indicate that compulsory ADR is appropriate. It needs to be a trustworthy process, it needs to be quality assured, it needs to be independent, well organized, and it needs to be proportionate. In other words, the burden on the parties must not be so great as to effectively prevent them from taking part. Before I go any further, let me just say any views I express tonight are my own eccentric conclusions from 21 years of practice and do not reflect the views of the Civil Justice Council or my fellow authors. Sorry about that. Proportionality. Jane and I are not saying that if you've got a £5,000 claim, you have to go and hire a suite of rooms at the International Dispute Resolution Centre at St Paul's or the equivalent in Dublin or wherever. We're not saying you've got a £25,000 claim, you have to go for the gold standard mediation package or Jane Player, as it's sometimes referred to. We're not saying that at all. We're saying that something proportionate has to be provided. And this is a challenge for the mediation community. We have to provide, whether it's time limited, whether it's fixed cost, we have to start providing a product that fits the broad range of cases and that can fit in with the compulsory requirement. But that's a challenge that will be met, I have no doubt. There's a mooted proposal at the moment that there should be, for cases in England and Wales under £500, should be automatically referred to the Small Claims Mediation Service. And that's proportionate because the cost to the parties will be £0, it's free. And it's proportionate because the time commitment for the parties will be about an hour of sequential phone calls with the mediator. So that seems to me permissible, and it's under serious consideration for compulsion, and we'll see how it goes. Compulsory Irish again. Just thinking about this, do you remember seatbelts? Remember when they used to try and persuade us to wear seatbelts? Clunk, click, every trip was the rather lame slogan in the UK, but people weren't wearing them. It wasn't macho. I don't know what the problem was. Compulsion made seatbelts culturally normal. And think about this. Aren't these, we're just trying to fit seatbelts to litigants. And the way some lawyers drive their cases, that seems like a remarkably good idea. Is it wrong to compel people to do something that's unfamiliar? Well, in the England and Wales at the moment, we compel divorcing spouses to go to an FDR, which is the most bizarre kind of hearing. You're going to go, you're going to see a judge today. The other side are going to be there. Your spouse is going to be there with his or her lawyers. You'll be there with us. And we're going to go to see the judge and we're going to talk about the case. And the judge is going to tell us what he thinks about the case. But actually, it isn't really a real hearing and it's not binding. We'll have another hearing later on. It'll look very similar and that will be binding. Now, this mesmerizing formula is successful. People understand it, they use it, they get the benefit from it. And if they can get their heads around that, surely they can get their heads around compulsory mediation. We always talk about taking the A out of ADR. It shouldn't be alternative anymore. It shouldn't be subsidiary. It shouldn't be some second best. It should be at the heart of the system. And yet, Sabine and Michael are suggesting that somehow there should only be rules about all the things that lead to a congenial final trial. All the rules, in quotes, should be for the 3% of litigants who actually end up in front of a judge in trial. The 97% who are going to settle their cases and need to settle them well and calmly and early, they can't have any rules to help them. It just seems to us to be a remarkable situation. Nobody has to settle. They do have to engage. And that's the message. Huge honor to be here tonight talking in David Richbell's honor in his debate. One of the nicest things about this whole process is that clip that you saw at the beginning this evening of Sabine talking to David, that infectious smile, the infectious laugh, a great man. We owe him an enormous amount. I'm sure he's enjoying this debate. I'm sure he's with us. If you have been, thank you for listening and please vote for the motion.
Thank you very much, Bill. Jane, did you have anything you wanted to add at this point? Very good. Then I will hand over to the opposition for their in-depth argument. Thank you.
Michael, I'll let you kick this one off and I'll mop up whatever's left at the end.
Thank you. Thank you. There'll be plenty of that, Sabine. I go back to my earlier point that by introducing a regime of mandatory mediation, one is really undermining the very basis of mediation as a voluntary process. And I'm not convinced by anything that Bill has said that the benefits of mandatory mediation outweigh the costs. And by the costs, I'm not talking in purely financial terms. I'm talking about reputational cost to the process of mediation and the success that it has achieved as a voluntary process over centuries. And so I'm still not convinced at all. And the disadvantages of mandatory mediation to me are many and varied. There is that prospect of reputational damage. I don't know the statistics in Ireland or indeed in the UK as to how many cases come before courts and how many of those might be suitable to go to mediation. But the thought that every case, perhaps above a certain threshold of value or excluding certain types of mediation, say in family law, or the number of mediators that would be required to service such a volume of disputes, to me, will make it quite impossible to satisfy that need. I don't know how many mediators there are at the moment, but I suspect there's anecdotally, certainly, there seem to be enough to service the present need, because I don't sense that there's any great delay in setting up a mediation. There are plenty of mediators around, only too willing to take up a case at relatively short notice. And that is a situation that will change inevitably, where mediation is imposed upon parties, and within a certain time frame, probably. If it's a court-ordered mediation, the court will specify a time limit within which the mediation has to take place. But even if parties are complying with what would then be the mandatory requirement to enter into mediation, how long is that going to take to achieve? Who's going to control the cost where it's a mandatory mediation? Who's going to exercise any sort of quality control over the standard of the mediator's training and education? Is it going to be potluck, as it is perhaps in certain legal aid schemes, as to the quality of the representative you get? Are we going to face the same situation where we have perhaps thousands of mediators who've had to be trained up at short notice in order to fulfill the need? These are some of many questions we must ask ourselves if we are considering that there should be mandatory mediation. And I think the answers to those questions, or even in some cases merely having to ask them, is a strong argument against the proposition that the benefits of mediation, of mandatory mediation, don't outweigh the costs. And but I mean, I have come to mediation quite late in life. I was a judge for 17 years, and I have seen people's lives totally destroyed by the experience of going to litigation. So I'm not arguing that parties to a dispute should not go to mediation. I am 100% in favor of mediation, but it doesn't need to be compulsory. It doesn't need to be imposed upon them. And I hear what Bill says about the fact that not enough people are going to mediation to settle their disputes, but that can be resolved in ways far less harmful to the process of mediation than making it compulsory. The public need to have confidence in mediation as a dispute resolution process. That means they need to be educated. Those of us involved in mediation should more publicly advocate for mediation so that it becomes known by the public generally and therefore accepted as part of a process by which they can settle their disputes rather than going to court. Lawyers, solicitors in particular, are required under our Mediation Act to advise their clients of the advantages of going to mediation rather than going to court. solicitors need to be encouraged through education, not only to advise their clients as to the benefits of mediation, but to be proactive in positively advancing their clients towards the door marked mediation rather than the door of the court. I've heard it said in the past that perhaps lawyers were hesitant to be too enthused by the prospect of mediation because it would cut their fee income. But I think that's too cynical a view to be based on reality. The advantages to a solicitor in advising clients to mediation is that you will have a more satisfied client with the possibility of repeat business if he or she has gone through a process voluntarily and has achieved perhaps a solution, the contours of which could never have been achieved even by a victory in court. A court decision is very binary in its nature. You win or you lose. And as we all know as mediators, the solutions that are possible within a mediation properly conducted and which has been entered into voluntarily is that solutions can be very flexible. And to have all of that endangered by making it mandatory to go to mediation will destroy the atmosphere in which those possibilities can exist. And I, for one, remain totally convinced that mandatory mediation is not in the best interests of anybody, particularly the clients involved in the dispute. I wonder, would I hand over to Sabine at this stage?
Michael, just a few quick points because I'm aware of the time. And one of the things I wanted to do was just take the civil justice report, with all due respect to you, Bill, and poke a few holes in it. Because I have a few concerns about the key findings or recommendations of the court. And number one is that there seems to be an idea that if mandatory mediation incurs no additional expense in terms of money or time on the parties, that in that instance, there is no cause for concern. Now, as a practitioner, I would say there are a lot more factors that have to be considered in terms of mandatory mediation as to just whether it increases the cost or the length of the process, not least the vagaries of the psychological conditions in which different disputants come to you, and not necessarily just in a family dispute, but I've had some commercial disputes where really the parties have not been in a suitable position to enter into mediation for a variety of practical and indeed psychological reasons. So I have a bit of an issue with that. I think that's a little bit simplistic. Secondly, I have to back up what Michael was saying in terms of the resources, and I do this from the perspective of this situation in Ireland. And now we've all been lauded for our Mediation Act here, and yes, hands up, it is a forward-thinking piece of legislation. However, it is the tiger that lacks any teeth, because all the crucial aspects of it that required financial input have been left dormant and sitting in the Act. And these are the ones that might have actually made a real difference to the uptake of mediation. So number one, there is the provision of mediation information sessions, hasn't happened. Number two, there is the code of practice, hasn't happened. And number three, there is the provision for a mediation council, which would address the concern that Michael has around the regulation and competency of mediators, hasn't happened. So unless the UK government is willing to put their hands in their pockets, and I don't know whether Ms. Patel or whoever is in the relevant position is minded to do that, to fund mediation, the proposals in the Civil Justice Act aren't going to work. Finally, I have to say very quickly, because I know Brian is going to just switch me off in a minute, the types of processes that tend to arise out of compulsory mediation, when particularly in a resource-constrained system, tend to be short, quick, brief processes, often on the phone. Who mediates on the phone anymore? We've got Zoom. they tend to undermine all those things that, Bill, you have said, you have praised as the essence of mediation. The fact that parties have time to talk about what's bothering them, the fact that they can come up with creative solutions, that they're not constrained by processes and rules and regulations. If you find yourself in a mandatory mediation process where you get 2 hours with a judge, with a mediator, possibly in a court annex setting where it feels like court light, that is not the type of mediation that you guys practice, I know, and that we practice, and it reduces mediation into something that is akin to court light. So that's my view on the matter, and I'll come back to the other things in the rejoinder.
Thank you all for your very well-timed arguments. It's my pleasant duty now to invite the proposition to conclude and rebut, for which you have 5 minutes. Over to you.
Well, I'll start and I'll let Bill jump in and finish off perfectly, as always. Look, forget the golden goose. This is a golden opportunity. Let's stop being so lily-livered. We know it's a good product. Let's get on with it and let's make it compulsory. It's only for everybody's own good. And a lot of the arguments that I've heard today aren't necessarily arguments against the proposition. They're all just challenges. Well, most good things have challenges. Challenges are there to be overcome. Yes, Bill has mentioned that we need to have a proportionate product. We need to think about the big and the little disputes. Well, we can do that. Surely the brains that are around the table here can sort out a way to overcome those challenges. It has to happen to make this undisputed successful process more prevalent. As Bill says, this is the seatbelt for litigation. We've got to stop the overflow of litigation. The courts are already warning us that they're overfull. The governments, many governments in many jurisdictions are pleading with people to negotiate sensibly. We have to help people manage their disputes better. And remember what Bill said, all people are only being compelled to engage in mediation. They're not being made to settle. So there are thousands of mediators out there. It's not a question of availability. We can certainly put quality control in place if people are worried about quality, but just because there are challenges doesn't mean it's not a good idea. And in my view, David would have voted for this. That gentle, kind, and generous man, even he would have agreed that sometimes you must make that horse drink that water. Bill, what do you think?
Well, very briefly, I think you're absolutely right. I think that all that's been identified on the other side are the considerable challenges we face, and we face them anyway. Accreditation, working out qualifications, working out how to quality control our work. It is true that the small claims mediation service doesn't provide a 10-hour therapeutic exercise. It gets massively good settlement ratings, and it gets very high approval ratings from the clients. It's an utterly different experience from court, and they like it. They like it. So we're not killing the golden goose. It's golden eggs all round.
Opposition?
Okay. Well, I'll just start and I'll hand over to you, Michael. So I just want to run with the seatbelt analogy, since that seems to be the metaphor of the day. And I put my hands up here and say, I grew up sliding around the back of a station wagon with about 11 other children and not a seatbelt between us. So, but I have changed my ways. And I think what has changed people's attitudes to seatbelts much more than laws and regulation is education, and all those gruesome ads that you see on the telly with people flying out the windscreen of their car. And I think that education is what is going to change the uptake of mediation. Little story, I was on a training call with a number of lawyers yesterday evening who are all pro-mediation. They're all learning about mediation. And even they admitted that they needed to do better in terms of how they explain mediation to their clients, how they fulfill their obligations under the Mediation Act, and educate their clients in relation to mediation. Now, this awareness is coming. My friend Judge Peart has made a huge contribution to this in the report he authored on legal education in Ireland, which was very visionary at the time and recommended the mandatory inclusion of ADR in every professional training curriculum for lawyers in Ireland. And we have, Jane is waving her arms at me there, and we have the Bar Council of India, who have recently mandated 45 hours of education on mediation for every undergraduate law student. You'll see with the growth of mediation competitions throughout the world that students are embracing this, and that next generation of lawyers is going to think differently about mediation, as a result of which their clients are going to think differently about mediation. So I would conclude by saying, I don't think we need compulsion. I think we can maintain everything that we hold so dear about mediation, including its voluntariness, if we put our efforts into education. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I just want to refer to Bill's reference during his contribution to Article 6 of the European Convention, and his view that mandatory mediation would not breach anyone's convention rights. I don't have the benefit of living in a jurisdiction where there is no written constitution. We have a written constitution here. I'm not denigrating your unwritten constitution, Bill, let me hasten to add. I'm just saying that under our constitutional regime, I would have serious concerns that a different view might be taken in relation to the denial of the constitutional right of access to court by the imposition of mandatory mediation prior to getting to court. I think there are strong arguments that might be made in that regard. We may be different, we may be slightly different to the UK jurisdiction or the England or Wales jurisdiction there. The second point I would just make is we all have different styles as to how we conduct our mediation and how we relate to the disputants at a mediation. But I tend to ask at a very early stage why they are here, what do they hope to achieve? And under the present voluntary regime, quite a useful conversation can develop where people express a desire to try and achieve a fair and realistic dispute, and they might throw out one or two possibilities as to how that might be achieved. In a mandatory regime, if I asked the same question, I suspect there'd be a significant number of parties who would say, well, I have to be. Why are you here? I have to be. And I don't think that's a very good start. So I think that demonstrates the difference between a voluntary process and one that is mandated. The third point I just want to make briefly, if provided I'm not running out of time, is where has the success of a mandatory regime for mediation arisen? What countries, what jurisdictions would we look to for a successful mandatory regime? I did a little bit of preliminary research this morning, and the one that came immediately up as a successful regime of mandatory mediation was Turkey. And on further exploration, I discovered that in 1 year, some 29,000 cases had gone to mediation, 28,333 of which had resulted in a settlement. Now, That on surface looks like an extremely high success rate. But I don't want to take lessons from a regime that has lost the essentials of democracy. In recent times, it's not a jurisdiction I would like to model my mandatory regime of mediation on, I have to say. So I haven't seen evidence of success from other jurisdictions, and I think I would need to see that and see what the model looked like before I could support this particular motion. I was going to end by something, well, referring to what Jane referred to. I think I was going to ask, perhaps rhetorically, because I unfortunately didn't ever know David Richbell, but I'd wonder what side of the argument he would be on if he was listening now. So I leave that question unanswered.
Thank you very much to all our speakers, and thank you for obeying my strictures regarding time. It's my privilege now to give a brief sum up as best I may before we vote on the motion this evening, which is that this House believes that the benefits of mandatory mediation outweigh the costs. And if I understood correctly, the proposition would have us believe that mediation is misunderstood by those who lead the horses to water, and that weak-willed litigation counsel and solicitors will revert to type when asked to go into battle and to joust for their clients, and that they need to be corralled into a process of mediation, which can overcome some of the challenges identified by the opposition through careful regulation, through delicate management of ensuring that the process is accessible, that mediators are trained, and that ultimately rights of access to justice are respected. And we heard the seatbelt analogy, we heard the seatbelt analogy raised on both sides. I recall that in my youth, children could slide around the back of the car, whereas things have moved on. It is now also compulsory to tie up your children in the back of the car in some make, shape, or form as well. And indeed, very often that is a relief for parents as much as a road safety requirement. We also have the observation that 97% of litigants settle anyway in an environment which is unregulated. So, you know, the suggestion from the proposition seems to me that, you know, you might get some bargain basement kind of settlement occurring without the well-regulated, perhaps more open and more encompassing process of mediation. So for these reasons, the idea of compulsory mediation is to be seen as an opportunity, and indeed one which will lead, like the improvement in seatbelts, to improvements in access to justice all round, but more quickly because of the compulsion. The opposition, I understood to say that compulsion will erode the confidence that currently exists in mediation, and by being forced to eat their broccoli, or by being forced to mediate in Irish, or to mediate at all, we will in some way put people off mediation. Now, it's not just a revulsion or a repulsion argument that is made here. The opposition raised questions about the quality of the mediators and of the processes to which people would be subjected if they were compelled to mediate. And moreover, the opposition suggested that there might be more to, if you like, the so-called benefits or maybe less to the so-called benefits of mediation when it comes to reviewing the process in terms of time, money, and indeed other benefits. The mediation bill and bills, if I may say so, on either side of the Irish Sea were called into question, particularly in the context of investment in knowledge by the users of mediation, and indeed knowledge of those who would be, as I said earlier, leading horses to water and introducing parties to mediation. And overall, I understood the opposition to be saying that if we could put more or much of this effort into educating the world, but particularly the lawyers and particularly the consumers of mediation, that the improvements in the uptake of mediation, which the proposition rightly point out are lacking, that the improvements in the uptake of mediation would flow naturally. So I hope I've done some justice to the arguments on both sides. Now, those of you joining us this evening in the seminar, we invite you to vote on the motion. So I'm going to hand you back to Aled Davies for a moment, who will explain how this is to be done using the Zoom poll. And it will be my pleasure, I'm sure, in early course to announce the outcome. Aled.
Thank you very much, Brian. Okay, we've got some great comments in the chat, but without any further ado, I'm going to launch the poll, and then you'll have an opportunity to place your vote anonymously. And then I will hand back to Brian. So this House believes that the benefits of mandatory mediation outweigh the costs. For, agree with the motion. Against, disagree with the motion. Or abstain. Okay. Let the voting begin. I want to say neck and neck. Goose neck and neck. No one mentioned foie gras, by the way. We had lily livered, Jane, but I think the Italians are rigging the vote somehow. Okay, we've got 20 more votes to come in. Wake up. All right. Oh, another 30 seconds, and then we shall end the poll. If I had enough time to contemplate this, the arguments on both sides were compelling. Brian, have you got oversight of the?
I do not, but I'm sure it's something you can share with me.
Okay.
I'm biting my nails.
I am going to end the poll. Oh, I can edit the poll. All right. Would the panelists care to vote? Okay.
We're not able to.
I've just enabled that feature, just in case.
Can you put it back up then? It doesn't show up for us.
Okay. Can you see the poll? Hang on. you have enabled panelists. Well, we'll just add your votes to the final tally.
or subtract.
You're making some assumptions there, Mr. Davis.
Okay, all right. I think I just share the results. So here goes.
Ooh.
Ah.
Hooray.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this evening's motion is carried. This House believes that the benefits of mandatory mediation outweigh the costs. So I'd like to thank our speakers sincerely for this animated and deeply provoking discussion of tonight's motion, and also for the spirit in which it was entertained, and of course for giving their time to share the memory of the great David Richbell. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much all for joining us this evening, and I hope that this will be something we can do, if not on a regular basis, on an annual basis. And if you can see a difference in those two things, please, answers on a postcard would be very welcome. We've had horses, we've had turkeys, we've had tigers with no teeth. We've had
geese.
We've had panelists voting for Christmas, and we've had geese. So it's also been a zoological evening, and once again, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed, and I declare the motion carried.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Just before I wrap things up, a word about our next live event, which will be in early March 22. So follow Mediator Academy on LinkedIn to find out more about that event. And if you head on over to our YouTube channel, where you can watch this show again this evening, if you choose, you'll notice that we have uploaded many of the early Mediator Academy interviews, including the very first one, which was with David Richbell, and he's being interviewed by a 12-year-old boy. Yes, that's me. But anyway, so head on over to our YouTube channel /Mediator Academy, and there's lots of other cool videos going up there. And I want to say a huge thank you to our panel, Bill, Jane, Michael, Sabina, for really making this event just the best. Really enjoyed it. And also the chief moderator for this evening, Brian. Great job. Super, super job. Thank you all for tuning in. And until next time, we'll see you all out with this.